Hi there. Before we start this episode of Fresh Meat Podcast, I want to quickly tell you about an upcoming event that I'm very excited about. On the 27th of April, so just a couple of weeks after this episode comes out, I will be taking part as a selector at an event being put on by House Pit Shy that I'm really, truly excited about. The lineup for this one is going to be something that I haven't been a part of in, 20 years, maybe more. The DJs on the night are going to be Trax, Mystic Bill, Justin Allislong, myself, and Nishkashay. This one is going to be an event not to be missed. It's happening at a West Side loft. This is an underground event. We're going to start at 11 p.m. and go all the way to 7 a.m. You can find out more about this event on Resident Advisor, on Facebook. If you just look up House Pit Shy, again, that is House, Housepit, and then CHI. You'll be able to find us and more information about this event on Facebook and Resident Advisor. I truly hope you can make it to this one. It's going to be a special night. All right, let's get on with the show.
You are listening to the Fresh Meat Podcast.
Fresh Meat Podcast, transmitting from Humboldt Park, Chicago.
Welcome back to Fresh Meat Podcast, this time for our 34th episode. For this episode, I sat down with label owner, journalist, and vinyl-focused DJ Steve Mizek. Steve has written about the music scene for years. He used to run the influential music blog Little White Earbuds. He's also helmed fantastic record labels like Tasteful Nudes and Argo. He's traveled as a DJ playing both solo gigs and touring with good friend Seville across the US and in Europe. Steve was nice enough to come visit Fresh Meat HQ for this interview, and we were able to settle in for a lovely extended chat about his journey in music, delving into his various perspectives on the music scene from the vantage point of a DJ, a label owner, and a journalist. We'll listen to the interview and check out an all-vinyl exclusive DJ mix that Steve put together for the show a little later on. Right now, we're doing something different for this episode of Fresh Meat Podcast. Other than Steve's DJ set, all of the other music that I play for you will be from our label, from Fresh Meat Records. If anything, it's a bit strange that it's our 34th episode, and this is only the first time we've played a whole slew of music from FMR for you. To get us started, we're about to check out a track recently released on Fresh Meat called Have You Ever? This one came out on the Archival 2 digital EP this past January 11th. The artist behind Have You Ever is a longtime friend of the label and someone who I've collaborated with several times, the talented musician and DJ Alexander East from Minneapolis. We'll talk more about Alexander and his music for the label after playing you this cut. For now, let's turn up Have You Ever and get into this groove. Once again, that was Alexander East with Have You Ever. That one appeared earlier this year on Fresh Meat on the Archival 2 EP, which came out digitally, and is available now in shops like Tracksource, Beatport, in Fresh Meat's Bandcamp shop, and ready to stream on Spotify and Apple Music. Alexander's track Just For Me was released on Fresh Meat back in 2016, and he and I have collaborated more than a few times. He sang on a track called My Bluff on my 2010 full-length album called Hip Shake Heartache, and he sang on a cut called Everything Is Alright on my Community album back in 2001. We've worked together on other things as well, but really the bottom line takeaway should be that Alexander is one of the most talented music makers I know. He's a singer, a producer, a DJ, a multi-instrumentalist, supremely charismatic, and just a joy to be around. One important note before we move on. Label The Night Owl Diner just released Alexander's Hazy Shade of Love EP on vinyl in February, and you need to make sure you grab a copy before they disappear. The Night Owl Diner only pressed 300 copies, and these records will surely disappear in the blink or two of an eye. Grab one before they're gone forever. All right, you are listening to Fresh Meat Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher, or if you prefer, you can stream us on SoundCloud, Mixcloud, or at freshmeatrecords.com. If you like what you're hearing, please do us a favor and spread the word about the show, and maybe take a few moments to review us on Apple Podcasts or on Stitcher, or just leave us a comment on SoundCloud or Mixcloud. I quickly mentioned last episode that I've been noticing that Fresh Meat Podcast is popping up on other aggregator sites like Chartable.com, Castbox, Flipboard, Listen Notes, and Player FM. If you're listening to the podcast from any of these other sources, please let us know. You can reach us either at Fresh Meat Record on Twitter, Fresh Meat Records on Facebook, Fresh Meat Records Music on Instagram, or just email us at info@freshmeatrecords.com. Links will be included to all of these pages in the show text. As always, thank you for listening and supporting the label and our podcast. Behind my voice, you're listening to the Mile High Connection by Jason Bay. Jason is a Milwaukee-based producer and DJ. The very first time I checked out this cut was when I was in Milwaukee for a gig back in 2015. The final version of this track came out in 2016 on the compilation When Bad People Cook Good Food Volume 4. The digital album included 15 other tracks, including music by Cesar Ramirez, Fish Go Deep, Dirty Jesus, DJ Jess, Aleph, David Durier, and a whole lot more. We also released a vinyl sampler from this album, which we pressed on 300 black vinyl copies and 40 or so translucent orange vinyl pressings. You should still be able to track down some copies of this record on Discogs or through Fresh Meat's Bandcamp store. Next, we're getting into 2 more tracks, followed by the interview with Steve Mizek. After the interview, we'll dive immediately into the exclusive DJ mix that Steve has put together for us. This next 2-song set is starting with a wonderful deep house cut called My RX by New York-based producer Luis Baro. Luis is originally from Chicago, but has lived in New York City for about the last 10 years, maybe more at this point. Luis has a storied history as a DJ, music curator, and event promoter, and has recently kicked into high gear his creative work in the recording studio. Keep your ears and eyes open for lots more music from Luis Baro in the coming months right here on Fresh Meat Records. The second track you'll hear is an unreleased cut coming out later this year on Fresh Meat. This one is called It Comes and Goes and is written and produced by another New Yorker, J. Gabriel. You might remember that during the last episode, I played a cut by J. Gabriel on Idyllic Music called You Know. This newer cut will be coming out in May with a remix by Canadian techno maestro Mike Shannon. Keep your eyes and ears open, as this EP is going to be something special indeed. All right, so in a few, we'll get into the interview and DJ mix by Steve Mizek. For now, let's check out My RX by Luis Baro, followed by It Comes and Goes by J. Gabriel.
You are listening to the Fresh Meat Podcast.
promised at the top of the show, we are going to be listening to Steve Mizek's DJ mix in a little bit, but he has been nice enough to sit down with me. I've got him here. Actually, he's been really nice because he's actually come over to my place for this interview. I always have to leave the house to interview people, so he's been super, super sweet. But I've got him here anyway for an interview, and we are going to chat for a bit. We're going to hopefully get to know Steve a little bit better before we listen to the music. So first off, thank you for coming over, and thank you for doing the interview.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me to your place. We've known each other for a number of years, so now it's great to be see where the magic happens.
I know, it's crazy. You've never been over. We've known each other now 7 years, 8
Roughly,
years,
yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
Right on. Cool. Well, welcome. The way I like to start these interviews is to not talk about music just yet. I call it your origin story. So very basically, I just want to know where you were born, where you grew up.
Sure. So I was born in Berwyn, Illinois, which is just outside of Chicago, literally on the border there. And then grew up in the suburbs of Chicago from there. So Westchester, which is a little bit further west, and then in Downers Grove, where I spent most of my years, which is southwest burbs of Chicago, not too far from Naperville and Joliet, if that gives some landmarks for people. And that's where I learned to love music as well.
Right on. And then, so I know when we met, you were living in the city proper. You were living inside the city of Chicago.
Right.
So how did that kind of progress, just as far as like where you were born, where you grew up, and then as you were kind of becoming a young adult, and kind of what happened? What's the process to getting into the city?
Yeah, for sure. So like as soon as I learned how to drive, of course, like the main attraction for someone in the boring suburbs is to go right out to Chicago. So I was coming into Chicago for like all ages shows and scaring the hell out of my parents every time I left with the car. And then I went to college at Bradley University, which is in Peoria, in Central Illinois. And as soon as I graduated, I was only at home for about a month, and I had to get the hell out. I chafed under my parents' roof, and so I moved out to Logan Square when it was still a slightly edgy neighborhood, and that was now 12 years ago.
Okay. Wow. So 2005-ish, 6-ish.
Yeah, 2006.
Like yeah. Cool. All right. So we've got your origin story, the very, very, basic bits.
Yeah.
Now let's kind of put some color on that with music. I love to ask people, like, forget about being behind the scene, making music, DJing, anything that has to do with being part of the industry, let's call it. Do you have a feeling like when music just as a person became important to you, whether it was when you were a kid or when?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, music was always a big part of my household. My parents are both big music lovers. My dad is a musician and used to be and still actually does make guitars, a luthier.
Oh.
And so like music was always in the household. And some of my early musical memories are like playing. My dad would play guitar, and together we would sing along to Beatles songs.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then I was in, I think, third grade. I joined concert band as playing the flute, and so I would then add flute accompaniment as well to what we would play. And then I think the music finally started to become like really important to me, or like something that I like actually like followed when around like 9 or 10 years old, when I first started getting CDs for the first time, and had my own radio for the first time. So, I could annoy my parents with 90s hip hop and pop music and R&B and stuff like that. But what I consider my origin story in terms of like music, especially as it relates to dance music, was when I was about 11 years old, which is the mid-90s at this point. There was a big resurgence in 70s culture. 70s culture was the thing, and so disco was back in a major way. And in Chicagoland, there was a huge like resurgence in 70s stations, disco stations. And so I started to get into dance music for the first time through disco. And I don't know if like the gay genes inside of me were just activated by that, but it really took root. And I started paying more attention to music that like specifically was beat driven, although I definitely have a wide range of interests that were sort of playing along at the same time.
Cool. That's really cool. So I feel like it's kind of the same way for me in that, like, I've got tons of disco records now and jazz and roots reggae and all this kind of like origin music, but that's not how I got into like dance music. Like, it was first through like house and hip hop and, you know, like electro on Tommy Boy and stuff, and the samples is what I knew first.
Yeah.
And then you're right, like in the 90s there was this whole huge get back to disco, get back to the roots, and I was like, oh, this is what this person sampled, and then I was like, oh, now I like disco.
Yeah.
So I did this whole like backwards thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because like disco now is like something that I only have like a passing interest in, because a lot of that music is sort of played out in a lot of ways, at least in terms of like pop disco. But it sort of did lay the groundwork for what I would come to, and it just sort of like made me understand what four to the floor beat driven music was, and how you could listen to a song for 7 minutes and not get bored. Yeah. Which is definitely, you know, harder to say when you're used to punk rock or stuff like that, which is also a big part of sort of my interest in being involved in music in one way, shape, or form.
Cool. This is all good because I knew almost none of this about this. So this is awesome. Just for me selfishly, I'm getting to know my friend more. To that end, so when before we had even met, the way I had heard of you was almost as a journalist first, right?
Yeah.
So the site that you ran, Little White Earbuds, I was reading that. I was an avid reader of that, and then I was like seeing your name in the little articles, and then I think we knew like mutual friends. So that's kind of how I knew of you. You were interviewing friends of mine, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's my experience. That's my first kind of like hearing of Steve Mizek. And then of course we worked together and we hung out together, and I know that you are DJing and you're creating music. I know about your labels. So that's kind of my chronology with Steve. But I would love to hear about what happened first. How you got into like, I want to be involved with this. Was it as a musician? Was it as a DJ? Was it as a journalist? Like, what was some of that evolution? Yeah,
for sure. So I think the biggest thing for me was that I knew that I really loved learning more about music. I was intensely curious about music. So when I was in high school, it was a two-pronged attack. On one hand, I started making a zine. I made a little zine called Plastic Sword Ninja that only ran for 2 issues, but it was a lot of fun to make, and I did some interviews and wrote articles and included bad poetry, that typical 17, 18-year-old thing.
You got to.
And then on top of it, there was our Downers Grove had, the main high schools had radio stations inside of them. So I had my own radio show when I was a junior and senior in high school. And that's when I first started to be able to like curate music for other people to listen to and have an audience. And that really had an effect on me that sort of carried through to college, where I also took on college radio. And then I went from being just a regular DJ there to being the music director for the radio station as well. So I was helping shape other people's tastes through, you know, what I was putting in the station and the reviews that I would write on the back there. And I also, in college, I was the resident music critic as well for the the Bradley Scout newspaper.
Okay.
And so I was mostly writing about pop music in one way, shape, or form, but I would always find a way to slip in some slightly more esoteric music, and occasionally dance music would come into that. And then probably like towards the end of my college years, so around 2004, 2005, and then 2006, like dance music started to become more important to me. I had been a big fan of like Daft Punk and Basement Jaxx when I was in high school, but I had never really cared about like actually like DJing. It was always like something that seemed unattainable to me because I'd never been to a club before. I hadn't even really seen videos of DJs, so I didn't really even know what that experience was like. I only knew like the board in a radio station where you could fade things up or down. So I remember the first time I actually beat matched was totally on accident, and it was at the radio station, and I just happened to press things at the right time and it faded up, and I was like, that was the coolest experience of my entire life. I want that experience again. And then so after I graduated college, I downloaded Tractor legally and started downloading just whatever I could find on Beatport, whatever was popular on Resident Advisor at the time. And simultaneously also started writing for Resident Advisor. And this was still when they were just starting to sort of reestablish themselves as a site with credibility, because I'm not sure everyone is aware, but they used to be basically a progressive house site. And then at some point, eventually they started to, they had new editors and they sort of turned things around. And I was part of that early wave of like starting to gain credibility in terms of who they were covering and what music they were covering. And I was writing for a couple other outlets across different types of music, but it got to a point where I was being edited so heavily by the editors there that I was frustrated, and I didn't really want to have to answer to anyone else. So I had been blogging in one way, shape, or form for a number of years, mostly just as like a fun personal exercise. But I remember in 2005, I was home for the holidays at my parents' house, and I hope they're not listening. I would go out and I would get stoned, and then I would get on the internet and I would just like browse the internet for music. And I started my first MP3 blog, which is littlewhiteearbuds.wordpress.com, which maybe still exists. I'm not sure. And so it's just an MP3 blog of whatever I was listening to at the time, with whatever pithy things I could think of to say about that music. And then I started taking it more and more seriously when people started caring. And then eventually I had people ask to start to contribute. So I turned it into a .com in 2007. And then it eventually blossomed into like a full-fledged music publication that I ran until 2015. At which point, having sacrificed a good like 8 years of my life to having like a regular schedule of reviews, interviews, podcasts, charts, all those sorts of things, I decided that I wanted to give myself a break and enjoy music just for music again. And around that time as well, and like the years leading up to that, I was also starting to take DJing more seriously, and also started my own record labels during that time too. So I had plenty of other things that were involving me with music, just not music criticism. So then, just to go back a little bit, in 2011, I started my first label, which was called Stolen Kisses, which only lasted three releases, but it was enough to let me know that I wanted to do that, and I was enjoying being involved in the music industry proper. And that was a little bit frustrating, though, because I was working with a distributor, and they were making a lot of decisions for me that I didn't really want made for me. And which seems to be a reoccurring motif in my life.
Well, but that's just distributors.
I mean, distributors in general.
That could be a whole nother interview.
Basically, yeah. So then in 2012, I decided to start a new label that was wholly funded by myself called Argo. And the focus of that label is about American dance music specifically. I was seeing a lot of European labels representing American artists and producers, and I didn't feel like it was benefiting the American scene as much as it would benefit individual producers, but I didn't feel like it was like, I felt like a lot of labels out there in Europe didn't really know what the struggle was like to be an artist out in the States, and like how a lot of us have to, work multiple jobs to be an artist at the same time as also, just to survive. And so that has been going on since then. And then just because I really loved spending money on black discs of vinyl, in 2013 I started a sub-label called Tasteful Nudes, and that was largely as a result of getting some demos from international artists that were too good to let other labels have. So I decided to start a typical, for that time, hand-stamped white label record label, and that sort of haven't really done as much with that recently, but sort of like a little bit more dance oriented, a little bit more DJ friendly in terms of what we would put out on that label.
Yeah, you've covered a lot of ground there.
Yeah, right? I hope I haven't gotten too far ahead.
No, it's great. Not at all. What I want to do, though, is just we don't have to spend too much time on it, but just unpack each one of those just a little bit. Like,
Sure.
for example, Little White Earbuds, you mentioned it in passing almost, but it was like a fully fledged, music press site, like interviews and reviews and editorials and events, and like there was a lot there. So maybe for that person who doesn't know about the history of the site or hasn't read the site, give us some like highlights, some things that you think was like, maybe this was a really good interview, or I'm really happy we did this, or I like this part of the site. Just tell us a couple of highlights about the site.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things we were doing is that we were generally not focusing on as much on what other people were covering. We were trying to uncover some artists that we liked as, avid fans. So, although they were starting to get known at the time, Prosumer and his production partner, Murat Topeli, were just starting to sort of get going in 2008 when I interviewed them. And it was really important for me to cover that from not only as a fan of their music, but also someone who was highlighting the fact that they were gay. And like that was something that was kind of glossed over in a lot of publications. So we talked about what it was like to be, even though like dance music history is born out of the gay scene in a lot of ways. It's a very straight scene in a lot of, or especially it was back in 2008. It's definitely come around a little bit now. And so it was interesting to be able to talk to them on that level and sort of have that shared experience and just getting them to talk about that. We did 200 official podcasts, which actually ended with Prosumer as the last one. But I got to have a lot of my heroes involved. I had we had to include some other people who I like didn't know as well, but it was really cool to sort of like represent a variety of things. One thing I'm really proud of is that for I think 6 or 7 years we ran a podcast competition for the last podcast of the year. We would always sort of just open things up to whomever would want to make a mix for us, and they only had a certain amount of time that they could do it in and a certain length. And as a result, some people who ended up sending us podcasts have actually gone on to be decently known DJs. But my favorite of all of them is one artist sent a mix of all of his own material, who went on to be the artist Royer, who put out we put out a Tasteful Nudes record.
I have that record. I love that record.
And those tracks were actually on that mix, and I was like, it placed third place, but I was like, these are really interesting tracks. Is any of this released? And he said no. I'm like, well, then great. Like, all the better for me. So it was just really cool as a discovery tool for me personally, and also for our readers. It was really difficult in some ways to be a publication based in the U.S. because a lot of dance music culture, despite its sort of origins here, is based in Europe. The real industry is there. So I felt like very disconnected a lot of times from sort of our audience and from fans, especially in Chicago, where the scene is really a bit smaller and like, it's tightly knit in a lot of ways, but at the same time, like, not everyone read Little White Earbuds or cared about Little White Earbuds, which is fine. But after it wrapped up, I had a lot of well-known producers and DJs come up and thank me for doing it, because they said, hey, people wouldn't have known who I was or what I was doing at that time. LaVon Vincent actually took time to thank me. He was like, without you and RA, like, I wouldn't have a career.
Yeah.
Sandwell District made sure to send me a copy of their Feed Forward album that only put out like a few, like 2,000 copies of, because we were big supporters from the early days. And we were also just not afraid to do negative reviews as well. We weren't afraid to talk about the things that like weren't great ideas. And I feel like there's a lot of boosterism inside of dance music culture to focus only on the positive. But realistically, criticism is supposed to be on both sides, and it's only really meant to highlight, to give people perspective,
sure,
and to let people know, like, maybe what they don't know about what they don't know about a release, or maybe, like, hey, this release maybe really seems really cool, but it's ripping off these 3 records, right, that are like context. that are like way better, or and obviously a lot of this is subjective, but it felt good in some ways to be the people who weren't afraid to see both sides of things.
Yeah. Okay, so let's come closer to the present. I know that lately, and by lately I mean, let's say the last couple of years, you have become much more focused on your art as a DJ. And you've been traveling, and tell us about that. So what are you focused on now? What have you been focused on recently? Where has it taken you? What's going on?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. I've really had like a somewhat short but intense spike in activity. I would say in 2014, I started taking DJing more seriously, partially as a result of I was DJing a lot with my close friend John Paulo, who produces under the name Sabre. And we really sort of together unlocked a new level in each other, because we would always play back to back. We never played, I'll play for 5 tracks, you play for 5 tracks. It was always feeding off each other. And that really I really work well when I'm in response to something. I love playing music by myself too, don't get me wrong. But I really just something about finding interesting intersections was really spurred me on creatively. So that sort of fueled, both of us realized that we were really great together, and we just started taking on more gigs locally, and then that started leading to more traveling around the country, and then eventually to Europe as well. In 2015, I played my first gig. 2014 I started playing internationally, but always smaller gigs. And then 2015 I managed to score a gig at Panorama Bar by myself, and that led to a joint gig with John Paulo at Panorama Bar as well. We got to play twice there. And actually, as of right now when we're recording this, not to date this at all, but he's actually on his way. He just made his way over to Europe, and he's actually going to be playing Panorama by himself for the first time. And so, I mean, actually, recently, DJing has actually taken less focus for me. I've been trying to treat myself better and trying to focus a little bit more on things that feel a little bit less like work. Not to say that DJing is ever really work, but it is definitely takes time, it takes effort, and
the traveling.
The traveling is really hard, and also I consider myself to be somewhat introverted in a lot of ways, and being a DJ, people expect you to be the life of the party.
Yeah.
So I really it was helpful DJing with John Paulo, because he could be the life of the party and I could take the back seat, but it's still it would lead to some situations where I wasn't always comfortable being out and about and trying to be the fun guy for the people who were throwing the party.
Right.
And so it's been nice to sort of back up and only focusing on gigs where I'm having fun, or I'm playing parties that are very specifically my sound, or this year I had a residency at this party called Makeout Party that took place at Jackhammer up in Edgewater. And those were queer parties and with kind of a sexy vibe to them, which was something I really I enjoyed, but I wasn't really invited to do so much. So it was cool to finally have a little bit more of a foot in that scene as well. And now it's just sort of I'm taking gigs that really speak to me, or there's something really exciting about it, and less about just needing to be out there every weekend.
Sure.
Especially because now it's even less about the money and much more about sort of the quality of the experience. So last year got to play Queen, which for those of you who don't know is Chicago's best party.
Absolutely.
Every Sunday.
I talked about it on the show, so hopefully they know. But
hopefully they know. If you don't, you should definitely go. But it's I got to play it with one of my best friends, James Murray, and we had a really spectacular time. And so those sorts of gigs were just really sort of satisfied being gave me the sustenance to know that it wasn't important to play all the gigs, but just to play the gigs that really made me feel good.
Yeah. gosh, it's so much more fun when your passion doesn't feel like it's your job, right?
Right. and that's tough because a lot of us, especially in sort of like this late capitalism era that we're in, it's sort of like a somewhat natural inclination to commoditize or to commercialialize one's passions into becoming, industry or some sort of like, a working hobby. And that's I won't speak down on it at all because it really motivates people. And especially when you make money for the things you love, then you have more room, financially to do the things you love. But it also can sort of like, it can become a cycle. And it can be a little bit difficult to get off the cycle. And then, you're thinking, I need to find music because I have a gig, as opposed to I want to find music because I love music.
Yeah.
And I'm really enjoying like finding these things. So as a result of me playing less gigs, I've been listening to a lot more music that doesn't relate to dance music. And I've been really enjoying it for the first time in a long time. And so I've really been enjoying sort of just like, actually, this is maybe a little bit weird for this podcast, but I've been digging into Mariah Carey's back catalog. I've just been like, I've been finding artists who I know a little bit about and just really going deep on them. Mm-hmm. And that really sustains me. Because I am intensely curious about music in general. So I'm just finding different ways to sort of scratch that itch that don't feel like there's any sort of work component at all.
Do you want to tell us anything about the future? Like, one thing we haven't talked about, so when Steve, I hope you don't mind if I'm sharing this, when Steve's talking about music as a passion, it's because he's also very involved, like, with the career that he has going on as well. So there's a whole other part of Steve's life that we have not talked about that takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, effort, and he's passionate about that as well. So I mention that because I'm wondering, with everything that you have going on with work and with moving, which we haven't talked about, and all the other things, what are you thinking the future holds for you when it comes to music that you have your hands on? What does that look like, or do you have any ideas?
Sure. I mean, I'm definitely like trying to explore some different ways of like running a record label. I'm focusing less on vinyl because where we're at right now as an industry, it doesn't always lend itself to vinyl sales. And, as much as I've loved sinking thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars into records, and I have a storage space to prove it, I'm trying to find different ways of offering music that don't necessarily involve 12 inches and then don't necessarily involve strictly just dance music or strictly producers.
It kind of restricts almost. It's weird to say this, but having vinyl label or predominantly vinyl label almost restricts you creatively.
Yes.
Because everything is such an investment that if you love something, but you or your distributor says, I can't sell that, even no matter how much you love it, you're like, I can't sink the money into that.
Right. It definitely changed the calculus. I mean, and I appreciate that limits in some ways because it definitely has made me focus on quality control. I look back at my catalog and I say, I stand behind this stuff because I knew that it had to be as good as it possibly could be. And regardless if the sales bore that out or not, I could feel like I did, the right thing. So right now we've actually been putting out a series of mixtapes. And when I say mixtapes, I mean literal mixtapes. Right. These are something that feel homespun, but at the same time are done by professionals of varying levels of career. So we've been having people who aren't producers make mixes of different sorts for us. And that's been really satisfying because when I was still learning how to make mixes, before I was a DJ, mixtapes were a huge deal for me, sitting there with a tape deck and, taped over the corners of a tape. And so it sort of harkens back to that era for me. And just gives some shine to some people who aren't necessarily known for anything other than doing a radio show. We had a Chicago selector, Kat Sutherland, who runs the Destination Unknown radio show. She did a mixtape for us. She's been involved in music for more than 30 years, but no one had really ever given her the chance to showcase that outside of her own radio show. Turtle Bug, who's originally from New York, one of my favorite DJs, but someone who's really just a DJ in terms of like what his specific, where he's really at his best. So I really wanted to show off his sound. And then actually the first mixtape was by this guy, Brandon Wilner, who works for Resident Advisor now, but used to work for Little White Earbuds back in the day. And he's known as Unscented DJ. And he made a really cool mix of all music that he found offline. Music that had nothing to do, and music you can hardly even find online, which is really cool. We're also working on, last year, is that right? Yeah, last year we put out a compilation called American Dance Music Volume 1. So we're working on American Dance Music Volume 2. But unlike last year, where I felt a little bit more pressure to release something regularly, because I'm sort of been taking a step back and slowing down a little bit, I've been slowly building it up and trying to represent sort of like a diverse cast. The first one was very focused on people who are around me, my friends, and this new one is a little bit more on people I'm just learning about. And because it's digital only, and it's not going to have the same sort of restrictions on it in terms of like how long it will take to release or what we can do with it. So I don't even know when that will really even happen, but it's in progress. Cool. Bit by bit. And it's really hard to say what's going to happen after that. I really believe in the beginnings and endings of things. I really don't like projects that sort of exist forever, because a lot of times the end result sounds nothing like the beginning. And not to say that consistency is the only key, but it's really easy to have sort of like mission drift. And before you know it, some of these big labels that you and I respect or once respected now have no relationship with their past. And I really
naming no names.
Yeah, exactly. No one needs to be shaded here, but I generally feel like it would, like, there may be a time to end Argo, and that might not be too far off, because I really want to be able to feel as passionate about it as I did maybe when I started it. And right now it's like less important to me in my life, and so I really want to make sure that I'm still giving it at that level. So maybe a couple more things, and then we'll see where it goes from there. If every book went on, as long as a writer was passionate about being an author, every book would be 3,000 pages. So, sometimes a story needs to find its ending.
No, I agree. And ending, actually every story requires its ending.
Exactly.
So, absolutely. To that end, this interview is coming close to an end. The way I like to end these interviews is I give my guest the last word. I'm sure everyone has heard me say this a bunch of times. It can be anything you want to say. We've had the whole gamut, people giving shout outs to loved ones, to people giving words of wisdom to young producers and young DJs, and all sorts of things. So I leave this to you, and the idea here is you say what you want to say, we close this with your words, and then we'll get into your music.
Great. I guess my last word would be, consider the future. Do not feel like the past has to dictate what the future is. I'm someone who has a great deal of passion for the history of music, but I feel like it's very easy to be held back by that and to let that dictate what the future needs to hold. And that goes from how you DJ and what technology you're using, what you're using to make music, what you want to make in the future as opposed to what you've made in the past. Always consider the future, because if you're not thinking about the future, you may make the same thing over and over again, and that can be really satisfying internally, and there's nothing wrong with that. But consider the future for yourself and for other people, especially as artists who put things out in the world. I think it's interesting to keep challenging yourself and challenging others, and I think you have to look forward to the future for that. I guess if I had to choose a last actual word for this interview, it would be peace.
You are listening to the Fresh Meat Podcast.
podcast from Chicago.
want to hear. Exactly what are you gonna do? Do something for me.
You are
listening
to the Fresh Meat
Podcast.
Fresh Meat Podcast, transmitting from Humble Park, Chicago.
You doubt in my mind. All my thoughts are all about you. Ways to touch your body that will thrill you through and through. I can make you happy. Through your mind, body, and soul. I can make you happy. Come let my love take a hold. I want you all for myself, so we can do the things that we like. Me and nobody else, 'cause your man ain't treating you right. He leaves you alone, and I'm there to comfort you, my sweet thing. You spend the day with him, but you spend the night with me because you know I can. I can make you happy. Fill your mind, body, and soul. I can make you happy. Come let my love take a hold. I can make you. 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 I can make you.
I can make you happy, girl, 'cause I need you. You on my arms, as I please you. Pull you close and then hold you tight. Your body and mine in the middle of the night. Squeeze and caress you and there'll be no other. Your soul and mine, a real lover. Yes, you're the greatest thing in the world, and I can make you happy, girl.
You must sit and wonder why I do the things that I do. It should be no wonder when all the love I have is for you. There's no doubt in my mind. All my thoughts are all about you. Ways to touch your body that will thrill you through and through. Yeah, I can make you happy. Fill your mind, body, and soul. I can make you happy. Come let my love take a hold. I can make you happy. Fill your mind, body, and soul. I can make you happy. Come let my love take a hold. I can make you. 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 I can make you.
Fresh Meat Podcast, transmitting from Humboldt Park, Chicago.
All right, that was 1 hour of house music woven together from 14 vinyl records by our guest, Steve Mizek. It was really a wonderful experience to sit down and chat with Steve about his creative journey so far. Big thanks to him for the interview and for the exclusive DJ mix for Fresh Meat Podcast. Steve was nice enough to provide a track list for his DJ set, so I'm going to go ahead and break down all the music you heard in his set and the tracks that we included in the background of our interview. During the interview, you heard 4 cuts on Fresh Meat. The first one was Cream by Densmore and Cort. The second song was also by Densmore and Cort. This one was called Let's Please the Sun. Then you heard Dirty Disc by Giovanni Damico. And the last song that you heard there during the interview was a track called New Beginnings by The Cushion. Then we got into Steve's DJ mix. The first song on his mix was Ging by Sabre on label Tasteful Nudes. Then he played Bart is Alone Again by Betonkust and Palmbomen 2. That one was on Dekmantel. Then he played Ensiedler by Agnès presents Cavalier. That one was on Drumpoet Community. Then Up in This House by NYDC on Tribal America. Then a track called Us by Royer on Tasteful Nudes. Then he played Seashell by Garrett David on courtesy of Balance Recordings. Then a track called Falling in Love Again by BME Project. The label on that one was Bottom Line Records. Then a cut called Rhythm Number 1 by Ketiov. The label is Running Back. Then a track called Moons and Flowers by Session Victim. The label there is Delusions of Grandeur. Then he played Get With Me, the Time Rider remix. Artist is Paris Red. Label is Glow Records. Then he played Tech This Out Part 2 by Charisma on R2 Records. Then he played I Can Make You Happy, the club mix by Donovan. Label is R Time Records. Then he played a track called The Rain by DJ Duke. The label is DJ Exclusive. And he finished his mix with a track called Evolved by Soul Capsule Productions. And the label is Aspect Music. And that is it. That is all the music, both from the interview and Steve's DJ set. All right, you've been listening to Fresh Meat Podcast 34. Make sure to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher so new episodes are automatically delivered to your computer or mobile device. If you're not into Apple Podcasts or you don't use Stitcher, you can listen to the show on SoundCloud, Mixcloud, directly from our website at freshmeatrecords.com, or a whole host of other podcast aggregators like Chartable.com, Castbox, Flipboard, Listen Notes, Player FM, and more, I'm sure. Behind my voice, you're listening to Return Flight, a track I originally wrote in the summer of 2008. This is the Eris Drew Larson internal edit. This version came out in January of 2010 as part of the full-length compilation When Bad People Cook Good Food, Volume 2. In addition to this edit, Eris Drew curated the entire album, putting together a DJ mix and several productions for the project. You can still find the album on all the usual shops and our Fresh Meat Records Bandcamp store. I love what Eris did here with her version, and really, the whole compilation still has a special place in my heart. Get out there and check out this album. Finally, the same as our previous episode, the last track for Fresh Meat Podcast 34 is by the talented Jan Paluca. You might remember that Jan is a French producer who explores the disco deep house sound. And this time around, we're closing the show with his cut, Reeves, which was just released as part of the 4-track Various Artists EP, Archival 3. Fresh Meat put this one out on a limited edition 200 press of marble orange vinyl. We've already sold the record out on our Bandcamp shop, but the record is just making its way to record shops worldwide, so you can very likely get it at your favorite shop. If you don't see it at your preferred record shop, hit us up and we'll get some to them. And that does it. That's everything for Fresh Meat Podcast 34. Thank you for checking out this episode, and please remember to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, or leave a comment for the episode on SoundCloud or Mixcloud. Also, thanks again to Steve Mizek for the interview and sweet all-vinyl DJ mix. Until we meet again, this is Reeves by Jan Paluca.
is Fresh Meat Podcast from Chicago.
Wake up now.